Park City, Utah at the Sundance Film Festival. This is Democracy Now!
And you have come through the snow, freezing rain to stand up. And why have we come here today? We have come here for respect, for women, for equal rights, for all of our daughters, for our mothers, our sisters, and our aunts. This entire year has been the winter of our discontent, but it has also been the year of our awakening, and awake we are.
Hundreds of thousands of women take to the streets across the country to mark the first anniversary of Trump's inauguration and the historic Women's March. We'll hear from the pioneering women's rights attorney Gloria Allred, who represents survivors of sexual assault and is a survivor herself, plus actresses Jane Fonda and Tessa Thompson. All three spoke here at a rally in Park City. Then we look at the new documentary RBG, about the life of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
In asking the court to declare sex a suspect criterion, we urge a position forcibly stated in 1837 by Sarah Grimke, noted abolitionist and advocate of equal rights for men and women. She said, "I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks."
We'll speak to the directors of RBG, Julie Cohen and Betsy West. And Democracy Now! Asks Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself about her thoughts on the Me Too movement and Time's Up. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Lawmakers are on Capitol Hill today amidst the third day of a partial government shutdown. Hundreds of thousands of so-called non-essential government workers are furloughed, meaning they're barred from working and won't be paid during the shutdown. The two agencies hardest hit by the shutdown are HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. The government shut down at midnight on Friday night after lawmakers failed to reach a budget deal. At the heart of the showdown is President Trump and the Republicans' failure to compromise on a plan for the nearly 800,000 young undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers. Trump rescinded DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, last year. Democrats have refused so far to agree to a budget deal that does not include a resolution on DACA. The Senate is slated to vote today at noon on a resolution that would fund the government for the next 3 weeks. Hundreds of thousands of women took to the streets across the United States Saturday to mark the first anniversary of last year's historic Women's March protesting President Trump's inauguration. In New York City, 200,000 people took to the streets, among them Desiree Jordan, who is protesting violence against queer women of color.
Here basically to say the names of the black women, the black lesbians that were murdered recently, and there's been no media coverage, particularly women that are silenced. I mean, it's horrific not to hear these women's names mentioned. We all know Trayvon Martin. We all know all the men, Eric Garner, that was murdered. We need to know the names of the women and the lesbians, black lesbians particularly, who are murdered in this country, and there is nothing in our media. And it's just horrific to think about a woman being killed just for being who they are.
Saturday's march comes amidst the nationwide Me Too and Time's Up movements, in which women across industries and class and racial lines have joined their voices to denounce pervasive gender-based violence and to demand an end to sexual harassment and abuse. In Los Angeles, tens of thousands of women protested, including the Academy Award-winning actress Viola Davis.
Listen, I am always introduced as an award-winning actor. But my testimony is one of poverty. My testimony is one of being sexually assaulted and very much seeing a childhood that was robbed from me. And I know that every single day When I think of that, I know that the trauma of those events are still with me today. And that's what drives me into the voting booth. That's what allows me to listen to the women who are still in silence.
That's Academy Award-winning actress Viola Davis. At a women's march in Morristown, New Jersey Saturday, the new First Lady of New Jersey, Tammy Murphy, said she was a survivor of an attempted sexual assault while she was a sophomore in college. In total, there were protests in hundreds of cities across the United States and around the world, including in Frankfurt, Germany, Kampala, Uganda, and Osaka, Japan. We'll hear more voices from the Women's March here in Park City, Utah, after headlines. In Michigan, female gymnasts who survived sexual assault and abuse by former USA gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar continue to testify against the doctor in court. Nassar's already admitted to sexually abusing the athletes when they were children and adolescents and then covering up the abuse by pretending it was part of a medical treatment. This is the Olympic gold medalist Ali Raisman testifying Friday.
I am here to face you, Larry, so you can see I've regained my strength, that I'm no longer a victim, I'm a survivor. Now is the time to acknowledge that the very person who sits here before us now, who perpetrated the worst epidemic of sexual abuse in the history of sports, who is going to be locked up for a long, long time. This monster was also the architect of policies and procedures that are supposed to protect athletes from sexual abuse. Abusers, your time is up. The survivors are here, standing tall, and we are not going anywhere.
During her testimony, Olympic gold medalist Ali Raisman also attacked USA Gymnastics and the U.S. Olympic Committee for allowing the sexual abuse to continue for decades.
Your abuse started 30 years ago, but that's just the first reported incident we know of. If over these many years just one adult listened and had the courage and character to act, this tragedy could have been avoided. Neither USA Gymnastics nor the USOC have reached out to express sympathy or even offer support. Not even to ask, how did this happen? What do you think we can do to help? Why have I and others here probably not heard anything from the leadership at the USOC? Why has the United States Olympic Committee been silent?
At least one woman has also testified she reported the sexual abuse to officials at Michigan State University, where Dr. Larry Nassar also practiced sports medicine. A growing number of sexual assault survivors, current students, and even one Michigan State University trustee are calling on university president Lou Anna Simon to resign over questions about what she and the university knew about Dr. Nassar's systematic sexual assault of female athletes on campus. Palestinian leaders are boycotting Vice President Mike Pence's visit to Israel, refusing to meet with him in protest of the Trump administration's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and its plans to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Pence has already met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and is slated to speak to the Israeli parliament today. Arab members of Israel's parliament are planning to boycott Pence's address. He says the embassy will move in 2019. In Afghanistan, at least 18 people were killed in a 14-hour siege of the Intercontinental Hotel in Kabul. The Taliban has claimed responsibility for the attack. Among the dead was peace activist Ahmed Farsan, who was in Kabul teaching classes and working at Afghanistan's High Peace Council. Turkey's launched a bombing campaign and ground offensive against the Syrian Kurdish city of Afrin in northern Syria. The U.S.-backed Kurdish militia controlling the area says at least 10 people were killed, 7 civilians, including 1 baby. The bombing comes after the United States announced plans to provide military backing for thousands of Syrian Kurdish fighters to form a border security force along the border with Turkey. Turkey's accused the Syrian Kurds of being terrorists. In Honduras, protesters staged another round of nationwide demonstrations Saturday against alleged widespread voter fraud and the re-election of incumbent U.S.-backed President Juan Orlando Hernández. Demonstrators blockaded dozens of roads and highways nationwide. The Honduran military has killed at least a dozen protesters since the demonstrations erupted after the November 26 election, including one 60-year-old man who was killed at a blockade on Saturday. This is the opposition candidate, Salvador Nasrallah.
We're going to continue protesting throughout this entire week, but logic tells us it's going to be difficult because people don't have enough to eat. And then you add in that the regime is killing people, like the man they killed yesterday in Sabah, and all the people they've beaten up. All of that is now in the hands of the United Nations and the human rights organizations. That said, I'm not convinced that these organizations have the capacity or the combativeness needed to resolve this. I'm getting the impression, and I hope I'm wrong about this, that these international organizations are primarily decorations, and that they're scared because they're funded by the United States.
In Africa, protesters staged nationwide demonstrations on Sunday in the Democratic Republic of the Congo demanding the resignation of President Joseph Kabila, whose term officially ended in December of 2016. At least 6 people were killed during a military crackdown against protesters. Dozens more were wounded. It's the second mass demonstration in recent weeks over the continuation of Kabila's presidency and the delay of new elections. In India, at least 17 workers died after a blaze broke out at a firecracker factory on the outskirts of the capital, New Delhi. Officials say workers were trapped inside the building when the fire broke out because grills had been illegally installed on exits, ostensibly in order to prevent theft. Police have arrested the owner of the factory. A new report by Oxfam says global economic inequality widened last year, with 82% of all wealth created going to the richest 1%. In contrast, the poorer half of the entire world's population received none of the new wealth at all. The report also says 2017 saw the biggest increase in billionaires in history. 90% of all billionaires are men. The Department of Justice has dismissed charges against 129 protesters who are facing the possibility of decades in prison for protesting at President Trump's Inauguration Day disrupt J20 protests 1 year ago. However, 59 protesters are still facing multiple felony charges. The group Defend J20 Resistance says the 59 defendants are facing up to 60 years in prison. To see our full coverage of the J20 trials, go to democracynow.org. And journalists at the Los Angeles Times have voted overwhelmingly to unionize. Journalists are demanding equal pay for women and people of color, lower health insurance premiums, and better salaries. Shortly after the vote's results were announced Friday, the newspaper's parent company announced the LA Times publisher, Ross Levinson, is taking a leave of absence amidst an investigation into reports he was a defendant in 2 sexual harassment lawsuits while working at previous companies. The search engine company AltaVista and Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Hundreds of thousands of women took to the streets across the country Saturday to mark the first anniversary of last year's historic Women's March protesting President Trump's inauguration. In New York City, authorities estimated over 200,000 people marched. Protests were also held in Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, and hundreds of other cities and towns. Here in Park City, Utah, protesters braved freezing temperatures and a snowstorm Saturday to take part in the Respect Rally. Speakers included the longtime women's rights attorney, Gloria Allred.
Snow, freezing rain to stand up. And why have we come here today? We have come here for respect, for women, for equal rights, for all of our daughters, for our mothers, our sisters, and our aunts. This entire year has been the winter of our discontent. But it has also been the year of our awakening, and awake we are to the lack of respect and the denial of our rights for women. Do you agree? This marks the end of fear being used as a weapon to silence women and to deny our rights. Do you agree? This is the year that women's voices have been heard, the year when women broke our silence about the injustices we have suffered, and the year when we said to rich, powerful, famous men, You can break our hearts, but you cannot break our spirits. We will not be silenced. We have reached the breaking point. We have reached the tipping point. We demand respect for our daughters, our granddaughters, our mothers, our sisters, our lesbian sisters, gay men, transgenders, and all minorities. We demand our rights. We demand the right to be free of sexual assault, rape, and abuse. Say after me: RIPE, resist, insist, persist, elect. Now, resist, persist, insist, elect. We demand the right to control our bodies and our lives. Resist, insist, persist, elect. We demand the right to choose legal, safe, and affordable abortions and not have our lives placed at risk by illegal, unsafe abortions, which cause many of us to be mutilated and die like I almost died when Roe v. Wade was not yet the law and abortions were illegal. Resist, insist, persist, elect. We demand the right to have contraceptives when men are getting Viagra. Resist, insist, persist, elect. We demand the end of sexual harassment and all violence against women and girls. Resist, persist, insist, elect. We demand the enforcement of child support laws so mothers can support their children and not be forced onto welfare and lives of poverty. Resist, insist, persist, elect. We demand the end to pregnancy discrimination in the workplace. Resist, insist, persist, elect. And we demand the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, that equality of rights shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Resist, persist, elect. And don't forget, insist. Insist. And let me tell you, Utah, we have 36 states who have ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, most recently Nevada. And now it is time for Utah. Resist, insist, persist, elect, and give a hearing to the ERA in Utah. Yes, let's hear it.
It is my huge honor here to be introducing the unintroducible, the formidable Jane Fonda.
Thank you for being here in the cold and in the snow. Yay, Sundancers. We're still marching. We're still protesting. But now we have to also organize. Last September, 50 women took a bus from Los Angeles to San Diego to join hundreds of grassroots organizers who've been canvassing there to flip the 49th Congressional District. They went door to door and talked to people, some of whom were ardent, avid Trump fans. The women didn't talk about a candidate. They never mentioned a Democratic or Republican Party. They focused on issues, the issues that people at the door cared about. And by listening and giving people information that they had not heard before, because, you know, Fox News, they were able to change minds. And just a few days ago, the Republican from that district, Trump's good pal, Dara Issa, retired. Yes. He was scared away by our organizing. Listen to this. The Tea Party with the Koch brothers learned what works. They learned from the successes of the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's and the LGBTQ movements. And they've been organizing under the radar for years. And that's how they've taken over state legislators and county supervisors and governorships. And this is really important because governors determine redistricting. So if we want to protect our voting rights, we have to take back governorships. Our democracy's survival and the Earth's survival depends on our ability to get people the facts, help them understand who is really on their side, and they're not alone, and then get them registered and motivated to vote.
Jane Fonda speaking at the Respect Rally in Park City, Utah Saturday to mark the first anniversary of the historic 2017 Women's March. Before that, the women's rights attorney Gloria Allred. During the rally, I also interviewed the actress Tessa Thompson, who you may know from her roles as the superhero in the film Thor, or playing Samantha, Sam White, in Dear White People, or performing as Diane Nash in Selma. I spoke to her just after she addressed the Respect Rally. Hi, I'm Amy Goodman from Democracy Now!
I know who you are.
Oh, my God. Well, I know who you are.
Are you kidding?
So,
I know who you are.
Your thoughts today on this first anniversary of the inauguration of President Trump, but also the first anniversary of the massive women marches around the country?
I mean, it's incredible to be here. I think that, a lot of movement has happened since then, and in many ways, not enough. I think until we can really create systemic change in legislation and policy, we'll continue to march, and that was something that was echoed by Jane Fonda and Gloria Allred. Like, I think that's where we are. And so I was really spirited to hear, particularly the words of Jane, helping us understand the ways in which it's important to organize. Because I feel like we're in such a cultural moment sometimes, that particularly in this media space that we live in, where you can feel like retweeting or hashtagging is enough. And I think we really need to get to a place of understanding in a real way with our friends and our family what we can do, how we can really create change.
Tessa Thompson, you played Diane Nash in Selma.
Yeah.
Talk about this civil rights leader and what this kind of activism from a half a century ago, if we're seeing it expressed today.
We're seeing it expressed. The thing that was so incredible about Diane, and every leader that I spoke to that's still alive that could tell me about Diane, of course I got to meet her as well, is just how radical she was. That she really felt like an important component of creating real change is tension, that she wasn't afraid of it, to create it even with the people that she collaborated with. And that kind of bravery and real dedication to getting to the core of an idea, I think is so fantastic, particularly in a political space. And so I was continuously struck by that. And she is that way still. I mean, she has such fierce integrity, and really believes in America so much that she can be quite critical, and that's, I think, what we need.
And now you are a black woman superstar in Thor. Talk about your message to young women in the world.
I think what's really been incredible about that, obviously the character Valkyrie has not historically been a woman of color, although she is in the context of the comics, she is depicted as sometimes a bisexual, so she's a queer woman. But it's been incredible to see young women come up to me and say that it means so much to them because they can see themselves reflected in a film like that. And I think for me, when I first got the part, I couldn't believe it. And I think a part of that is because I had not seen it before. And so I think that's where representation in media is really important. It's important when people are ingesting their popcorn, they're also ingesting images that make them feel hopeful about their sense of possibility.
That's actress Tessa Thompson at the Respect Rally on Saturday here in Park City. When we come back from break, we look at RBG, a new documentary about the life of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's here in Park City as well. Stay with us.
On the road to full equality, there's darkness, twists and turns, but now we stand to celebrate for all the world to see. With only one remaining marry me? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you're my favorite justice on the Supreme Court. Will you marry me? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you bring the rulings and I'll bring a little tour. On the side of fairness there you'll be, oh so resolute, your heart is pure. The worth of individuals you see, that Walmart's not a person, that's for sure. Will you marry me?
Anne Reid singing Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. This is our first day of our week-long broadcast from the Sundance Film Festival here in Park City, Utah. One of the most talked about documentaries here at the Sundance Film Festival looks at the groundbreaking life of the nearly 85-year-old Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. 2018 marked her 25th year on the court, and she has no plans to retire. Justice Ginsburg first gained fame in the 1970s when she co-founded the Women's Rights Project at the American Civil Liberties Union, where she argued 6 gender discrimination cases before the Supreme Court. When President Bill Clinton nominated her in 1993, he compared her to another pioneering attorney and judge who went on to become a Supreme Court justice.
Many admirers of her work say that she is to the women's movement what former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall was to the movement for the rights of African Americans.
In recent years, Justice Ginsburg's public profile has soared as the court has swerved to the right. Ginsburg often now finds herself on the dissenting side of opinions. In 2013, she wrote a scathing dissent in Shelby versus Holder, a landmark case that eradicated a key part of the Voting Rights Act. She wrote, quote, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Dissents like that helped Ginsburg cement her role as a feminist icon. She gained the nickname Notorious RBG, which became the name of a best-selling book. She has been portrayed on Saturday Night Live. Details of her exercise workout routine have gone viral. And now she's the subject of a feature-length documentary here at Sundance Film Festival simply called RBG. The film premiered on Sunday night, and none other than Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in the audience to see the film for the first time. Afterwards, she joined the directors Betsy West and Julie Cohen on stage, and it was there they had a chance to ask her a question. As you flew into Sundance on Saturday, thousands of women around the country were marching, rallying, and saying, "Me too," and "Time's up." And I'm wondering your thoughts on this movement and whether that demand you made so many decades ago you feel still stands. Take the boots off our necks.
I was glad to see that happen because the march, first march, Women's March, was hugely attended, and I wondered whether it would stop with that or whether the movement would continue. And I think yesterday was proof that it will continue. The more women who are out there doing things, the better off all of us will be for it. That's something that my dear colleague Sandra Day O'Connor often said. That the responsibility of women of our vintage is to get out there and to make a good show. And the more women who are out there doing things, the more younger women will have the courage to go on. I'm heartened by the number of women who will be in races for Congress and governorships and state legislative positions. So it was a favorite expression of Martin Luther King The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I added to that, yes, if there are people who will strive with all their might to see it happen.
That's Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg speaking Sunday night after the premiere of the new documentary RBG. 2018 marked Ruth Bader Ginsburg's 25th year on the U.S. Supreme Court. We're joined now by the directors of the film, Julie Cohen and Betsy Wright. Julie is a longtime filmmaker who's made 8 documentaries and was the creator of Court TV's Supreme Court Watch. Betsy West is a 21-time Emmy winner for her work as an ABC News producer who now teaches at the Columbia School of Journalism. Julie Cohen and Betsy Wright, it is so great to see you. Betsy West, it is so great to see you both. Julie, why don't you start off by talking about why you decided to take on Ruth Bader Ginsburg as the subject of your film? Why did you decide to follow her?
You know, how could you not is almost a question with RBG. Betsy and I had each individually for separate projects done interviews with her several years ago. We had followed her kind of stellar rise to rock stardom as young women began to sort of idolize her as the notorious RBG. And we just felt like, you know, someone ought to do a full-dress, serious documentary covering this extraordinary woman's life, and why not have it be us?
So, Betsy West, you've covered many different issues, and one of the things you've done most recently is the Makers series, Women Making a Difference. So, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, both you and Julie had interviewed her separately.
Yes, yes.
And what most strikes you about her? If you can begin by sort of giving us a nutshell description of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice.
Well, when you meet her in person, she's a very tiny person, and yet she has a kind of commanding presence. I think that's the contrast about her that really strikes you. She's a very serious person, the kind of person if you say, hey, how are you? She doesn't immediately jump in to tell you how she is. She thinks about it. She's very deliberate in everything she says. So, as she just said to us in the interview, I tend to be rather sober. On the other hand, she has a fabulous sense of humor. And as we discovered in the film, she loves to laugh. And so she's a multi-dimensional person with an extraordinary life story.
And I want to talk about that life story. I want to first, though, go to a clip from your documentary, RBG, where Justice Ginsburg talks about the first time she argued before the Supreme Court. In the case of Frontiero versus Richardson in 1972, the case centered on a female Air Force lieutenant who'd been denied the same housing and medical benefits as her male colleagues. Justice Ginsburg, then the lawyer Ginsburg, argued the Air Force's statute for housing allowances treated women as inferior, and the Supreme Court ruled in her favor 8-1.
It was not a single question. I just went on speaking, and I, at the time, wondered, are they just indulging me and not listening? Or am I telling them something they haven't heard before, and are they paying attention?
The justices were just glued to her. I don't think they were expecting to have to deal with something as powerful as a sheer force of her argument that was just all-encompassing. And they were there to talk about a little statute in the government code. I mean, it was just, we seized the moment to change American society.
In asking the court to declare sex a suspect criterion, we urge a position forcibly stated in 1837 by Sarah Grimke, noted abolitionist and advocate of equal rights for men and women. She said, I ask no favor for my sex.
All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet off our necks.
An excerpt from RBG, the documentary that's just aired at the Sundance Film Festival to much acclaim. In that clip, we also heard from Brenda Feigen, who is co-director with Ruth Bader Ginsburg of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project. So, Julie Cohen, let's talk about her life before she was the notorious RBG, before she was Supreme Court Justice.
Sure. I mean, you know, that was one of the big factors making us want to make this film. A lot of the people that love her and think she's cool and know about her dissents don't really know the full story and don't appreciate how much she achieved for women's equal rights under law in her career as a lawyer, particularly during those times, the Women's Rights Projects in the 1970s. Basically, she took on a number of cases. There were 6, including that one you just played, Frontiero, that she argued before the Supreme Court, winning 5 of them, making the case at a time when that case wasn't widely understood or even, you know, it was sort of hard for society and the male justices at the time to register the idea that, oh, wait, the Constitution should provide equal rights for men and women. She was following up on what Thurgood Marshall had done sort of the decade earlier, basically a slow legal march for civil rights for people of all races, and she was applying that idea to gender and had extraordinary success with it.
I wanted to go to another clip. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, nominated by President Clinton in 1993. This is during her Senate confirmation hearing, when she openly defended, and this was highly unusual, openly defended a woman's right to have an abortion.
This is something central to a woman's life, to her dignity. It's a decision that she must make for herself. And when government controls that decision for her, she is being treated as less than a fully adult human responsible for her own choices.
During Ruth Bader Ginsburg's 1993 Supreme Court confirmation hearing, Republican Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah questioned her stance on abortion.
The so-called constitutional right to abortion, a right which many, including myself, think was created out of thin air by the court.
But you asked me the question in relation to the Supreme Court's precedent, and you now ask me another question in relation to the Supreme Court's precedent. The Supreme Court's precedent is that access to abortion is part of the liberty guaranteed by the 14th Amendment.
Well, that was just reaffirmed by it.
That 1993 confirmation hearing, Betsy West, how unusual, especially in light of now in 2018. Imagine hearing a Supreme Court justice being so open about her support for freedom to choose for women, about her support for an abortion. Talk about the significance of this.
She was extremely forthright about this. She's a very principled person, and she was not going to pull her punches on this. I mean, the amazing thing is that after that, she was confirmed 96-3. I know, 96-3. And you heard, I mean, Orrin Hatch basically saying, look, we disagree, but I think you're well qualified to serve on the Supreme Court, and you've been nominated by our president, who happens to be a Democrat. That's the way this system works. It's kind of poignant and extraordinary to hear that today.
You both interviewed Orrin Hatch. I mean, you interviewed him for the film.
Yes.
Did he say he would support her today? I mean, he was very laudatory of her.
Yes, he was. First of all, he said, I love Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He said that. I was like, what? Really, he admires her so much. He admires her brain, and he admires her character, what she stands for. And he said, look, I think it's a good thing for the court to have an articulate, smart liberal on the court. He said, I think it elevates the entire conversation, the debate. I was surprised by how forceful and strong he was in his ongoing support for her.
And talking about relationships that might surprise some, her relationship, Julie Cohen, with Justice Scalia, and the significance of this, the history of this before Scalia died.
Yes. I mean, Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg were quite close going back to their days together on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit in the 1980s, admired each other as kind of intellectual sparring partners, and really liked and loved each other as friends. They both loved opera. They both had a lot of other intellectual interests in theater and in literature. And the fact that they disagreed so vehemently on the law extraordinarily seemed to have made them closer to one another. They didn't deny that it sometimes wasn't exactly pleasant. After one example that the justice has talked about is, after Bush v. Gore, when they were couldn't have been more opposed to each other's point of view, when the stakes couldn't have been higher. At one point at the end of the evening, he gave her a call and said, Ruth, go home and take a hot bath, and we'll see each other again in the morning. And, it's a kind of...
And for those who aren't familiar with Bush v. Gore, though they may have become familiar with the results?
Yes, the Supreme Court decision that ended the recount in Florida and led to George W. Bush becoming president of the United States.
Being chosen as president by the U.S. Supreme Court.
By the U.S. Supreme Court.
And she dissented.
Right.
Yes.
Justice Scalia was one of the architects of the majority decision, saying having George Bush become the president, and Ruth Ginsburg wrote one of several. I think there were a number of dissents in that case, but was one of the dissenters in that case.
And this issue of Ruth Bader Ginsburg being the dissenter, young people who are following her now, that's all they would think about. But that actually wasn't always the case. And you have a really interesting sort of image that you have in the film RBG, where you show her right in the center there, much closer to the conservatives, and then how she moves to the left. Betsy West.
Yeah, as one of our interviewees said, she was never meant to be the great dissenter. She always wanted consensus, and she still wants consensus. She has a very practical view of the law, and she's always trying to bring people over to her side. It's very important to her that she have collegial relationships with her fellow justices, and that she makes reasoned arguments. She's not a bomb thrower. However, when push comes to shove and she feels that the Constitution is not being followed, she's not afraid to issue a very scathing dissent. And as she says, look, I'd rather be in the majority. But when I'm not, I will write a dissent.
And she's got the doily collars. That's what I call them, because they look like doily. The different ones, what do you say?
Jabot is the name of them.
Oh, excuse me. Excuse me.
Jabot. She and Sandra Day O'Connor came up with this together. And
she's got the different ones for when she's in the majority opinion or when she's expressing the dissent.
The dissent, yes. It's her. She has a great fashion sense, and she brings her fashion sense to her clothing on the Supreme Court.
And, when Supreme Court justices come out to read opinions, it's not publicly known yet what the decision is going to be. So if you're in the courtroom, of course, there aren't cameras in the courtroom, but if you're in the courtroom, you get to preview a few minutes earlier, because from Justice Ginsburg's collar, if she's going to read an opinion and she's wearing that lovely sort of black, sparkly, fan-shaped collar, she's about to deliver a dissent.
We're going to go to a break, and then we're going to come back and hear a really interesting comment from Justice Ginsburg just yesterday. She spoke at the Filmmakers Lodge. She was interviewed by NPR's Nina Totenberg, and she talks about this seminal foundational work of Catherine MacKinnon and how it changed her view also of women's rights and what the whole issue of gender harassment is all about. This is Democracy Now! We're talking about a film that just premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. It's called RBG and is about the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the Sundance Film Festival in Park City, Utah, and we will be here for the week. Yes, from the Sundance Film Festival, where a film about Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg called RBG has just premiered. Well, before the film on Sunday, Justice Ginsburg, who flew into Park City, Utah this weekend, was interviewed by NPR's Nina Totenberg, a dear friend of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's. Totenberg asked Ginsburg if she had ever been sexually harassed herself. This was the Supreme Court Justice's answer.
The answer is yes. Every woman of my vintage knows what sexual harassment is, although we didn't have a name for it. The attitude to sexual harassment was simply get past it. Boys will be boys. Well, I'll give you just one example. I'm taking a chemistry course at Cornell. And my instructor said, because I was uncertain about my ability in that field, he said, I'll give you a practice exam. So he gave me a practice exam. The next day, on the test is the practice exam. And I knew exactly what he wanted in return. And that's just one of many examples. This was not considered anything you could do something about, that the law could help you do something about, until a book was written by a then young woman named Kitty McKinnon, Catherine McKinnon, and it was called Sexual Harassment in the Workplace. And I was asked to read it by a publisher and give my opinion on whether it was worth publishing. It was a revelation. The first part described incidents like the one I just mentioned, and the next was how this anti-discrimination law, Title VII, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, national origin, religion, and sex, how that could be used as a tool to stop sexual harassment. It was eye-opening, and it was the beginning of a field that didn't exist until then.
Just to close the loop here for a minute, what did you do about the professor? Did you just stay clear of him? What did you do?
I went to his office and I said, "How dare you? How dare you do this?" And that was the end of that.
I assume you did quite well on that exam.
And when I deliberately made 2 mistakes.
Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg speaking with NPR's Nina Totenberg, a woman who has interviewed her for decades. They've known each other for 40 years, and she is one of the people interviewed in the new documentary about Ruth Bader Ginsburg that will go throughout the week called RBG. Our guests, again, are the film's directors and producers, Julie Cohen and Betsy West. Betsy West, the significance of what Justice Ginsburg said, saying that Catherine McKinnon was so seminal.
Well, I had never heard her talk about this, but it's absolutely true that there really was no word for sexual harassment. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg was being discriminated against as a young woman, and then later all of the women who flooded into the workplace in the 70s just sort of felt like, hey, this is the price of entry, something we got to put up with in order to have these fantastic jobs. And it was Catherine McKinnon who was really just a young, just out of law school. She may still have been in law school when she started working on this concept and wrote this paper that was absolutely seminal and, in fact, was quoted by the Supreme Court in the mid-'80s, parts of some of the exact language that she used. And as Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, it was a revelation. Hey, this is wrong, and it's actually unconstitutional. That's something that I think a lot of people don't understand.
And, you know, we can't talk about your film, RBG, without talking about her family, her relationships, and particularly her husband, who was also a well-known lawyer. Julie Cohen, if you can talk about this love story that lasted for over half a century.
Yeah, I mean, the love and marriage between Ruth and Marty Ginsburg is sort of like, it's not just romantic, but I think it's really an inspirational part of a feminist story. Ruth Bader Ginsburg would say, often the way like a super successful man talks about his wife, she'll say she wouldn't have gotten where she got without him pushing. And it's absolutely true. They met at Cornell, where they were both students. They fell madly in love. Ruth Bader Ginsburg said he was the first guy who even seemed to notice that she had a brain.
That's because she was so beautiful.
Because she was so beautiful, by the way. Yes, and he basically, although he was an incredibly successful tax attorney in his own right, he really devoted a lot of his life both to the family. He was the primary cook, and he certainly shared childcare responsibilities with her. And then he devoted a fair amount of his time and energy to pushing her career forth. She's not the type to go around self-promoting. He was not shy about promoting her.
And talk about that, because we just played that clip of President Clinton nominating her. But how did that happen? How did Ruth Bader Ginsburg come to Clinton's attention? She wasn't the only one he was looking at.
Yeah, I mean, Clinton himself says that he wanted to nominate Governor Cuomo. Cuomo didn't want to do it. And then he started looking around and yes, definitely because of the Marty Ginsburg campaign and others of her supporters who just felt that she was a legal giant, her name came to his attention. But as he says, Marty Ginsburg wasn't the only person lobbying for somebody. And when he met her in person, he told us that within 15 minutes of their conversation, he knew he was going to nominate her. It was kind of a meeting of the minds about the law, the best way to make law. And so he was really taken by her. She was 60 years old when she was nominated. That was actually kind of on the old side. But he decided that she deserved it.
I want to turn to the 2007 Ledbetter versus Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company pay discrimination case. The Supreme Court rejecting Lilly Ledbetter's claim of pay discrimination at a Goodyear tire plant in Alabama, where she worked as an overnight supervisor for 19 years. The decision moved Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to read her dissent from the bench, a relatively rare move reserved to criticize the majority opinion. This is part of Justice Ginsburg's dissent.
In our view, the court does not comprehend or is indifferent to the insidious way in which women can be victims of pay discrimination. Title VII was meant to govern real-world employment practices, and that world is what the court ignores today. Pay disparities often occur, as they did in Ledbetter's case, in small increments. Only over time is there strong cause to suspect that discrimination is at work.
So the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act later passed in response to the Supreme Court. The significance, Julie?
Well, I mean, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act was a very important piece of legislation, and the significance in the RBG story is reminding you that, yes, of course, a key role of a Supreme Court justice and what you think of as maybe their greatest potential for accomplishing change is in a majority opinion they write. But Justice Ginsburg really made a huge difference in our laws by the dissent that she wrote in Lilly Ledbetter, not only where she explained the unfairness of the statute of limitations that had been placed on how long a woman could wait to make a claim about being paid unequally, but her dissent, she just came right out and said, like, the ball is now in Congress's court. Like, you know what? Maybe we're a little stuck here on the judicial side. Congress, take some action here, and Congress took her up on it, and the law was passed and signed into law. Actually, the first piece of legislation that President Obama signed when he was inaugurated in January 2009.
At Sunday's interview that NPR's Nina Totenberg did with Justice Ginsburg, she pointed out that Justice Ginsburg had hired clerks through the 2020 term and asked her about how long she'll stay on the court.
My current answer, the answer that will continue to be my answer, as long as I can do the job full steam, I will be here.
So that's Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Betsy West, she has chosen her clerks through the 2020 term.
Think she's sending a signal? Yes. She seems very determined to continue doing the job that she loves. I mean, one of the
survivor of pancreatic cancer and colorectal cancer.
One of the most amazing scenes for us was filming her in her gym with her trainer, where she works out twice a week. She does a grueling 1-hour workout without fail. She is well, and the workout involves, you know, planks, push-ups, medicine ball, the whole routine.
It's the new Jane Fonda workout video, I'm expecting to say.
85 is the new 45. Who knows? I mean, she is determined to keep herself in shape.
We have 10 seconds, Julie. What most surprised you in meeting Justice Ginsburg and doing this documentary?
You know, there are a lot of legends that have arisen about Justice Ginsburg over the past couple of years as she's become the notorious RBG, including the workout, including her long work hours. I think the surprise was that most of those legends are true.
Well, I want to thank Julie Cohen and Betsy West, directors and producers of the documentary RBG, which just had its world premiere here at the Sundance Film Festival. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.